Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening to you all. Good evening and welcome to this conference, Terra Madre 2022. My name is Francesco Sottile and I am a teacher or lecturer from the University of Palermo and a member of the Council for International Slow Food. I would like to welcome all the speakers here today and also convey Slow Food's best welcome. This is one of the most important conferences for slow food because loving the earth is an expression that slow food really loves, considering what it has been doing in the over 30 years of activism throughout the world. The center of the agricultural model for slow food is of the utmost importance, a sustainable small-scale model, which is where we find the meaning of one's approach to the land that has its roots in agroecology or agroenvironmentalism. This is why for us it's very important to talk about the relationship with the land, with maintaining and defending ecosystems and natural systems. All the projects that Slow Food has developed, from the most ancient ones, the Ark of Taste, Presidia, till the latest, which we're recently submitting in another hall. That is to say, the one whose objective is to save the meadows and the relationship with animal well-being are all projects that strongly interact with the conservation of the earth and of its land. We are experiencing or living, as you say in Italian, the times where we reap the harvest of the lack of interest and unsustainable system which we've had for decades. So today we feel the urgency to act differently, to act moving towards a real ecological transition that is able to perceive the real symptoms of a virtuous future. Agroecology is the underlying base of all our activity. Our projects that have thousands and thousands of farmers that are the backbone of our activity are based on a virtuous relationship with the earth, respecting the fertility of the land, regeneration of soil, and the respect of the microorganisms that are the incredible network within and under our soils that will save us from CO2 in the atmosphere as well as other things. Hence, a conference such as this one, with extremely qualified and skilled experts, become a point of reference in Terra Madre 2022. And I would like to thank all of them. I would like to thank you for being here and thank all those who will give a contribution, which I am sure will be extremely important. And thanks to Natasha Foote that will be moderating or chairing the meeting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Francesco, for that very comprehensive introduction. As he said, I am Natasha Foote, and I will be moderating today's panel session. So I am an agri-food journalist based in Brussels, and I'm very happy to see you all here for this panel session, Loving the Earth. So it is no secret to anyone by now, and certainly not to those of you in this room, that in the name of feeding the world, the agriculture sector has been a major destructive force. So I think we're all very aware of this, and therefore very aware of the need to understand and explore the policies and thought processes that have underpinned the creation of an unsustainable agricultural system. So the question is how to move away from this model and into sustainable farming and regeneration, and how we can best manage our relationship with the land, water, and coexist with life on this planet. So here to help us answer this question and more, we have a number of very distinguished speakers here today who will share their stories with us and discuss just how vital this regeneration is for the future of our food. So let me quickly introduce the speakers today. So here to my right, we have, and I apologize for my terrible pronunciation, a very British accent, Piero Bevilacqua. Yes? Okay. Who's a former professor of history at the University of Rome La Sapienza and an author of numerous books on the environment, development, and capitalism. We also have Myrna Cunningham, who is an activist for indigenous rights, president of the Fund of the Development of Indigenous Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the Pawanka Fund, which helps support Indigenous peoples' initiatives. If you're not familiar with their work, I do invite you to look that up after the conference is over. We also have Larissa Mies Bombardi, who is a Brazilian teacher currently in exile in Belgium. And I will let her explain a little bit about this story later on in her own words. But Larissa is the author of a book about the use of pesticides in Brazil and the connections with the EU. And last but most certainly not least, we have Virginie Raisson, who is an international relations analyst specializing in prospective geopolitics and director of the French Research Institute Le PAC. So as you can see, we have a wealth of different voices, perspectives, and experience in what I'm sure will become a very rich, interesting discussion. But before we get stuck in, I'll just say a quick note about myself. I've already introduced myself, but I specialize in EU policies and the agri-food sector. So everything from the Common Agricultural Policy to trade policies, everything in between. So my job today here is to bring a few of the perspectives from Brussels and weave in kind of different EU policy initiatives, the current discussions there, into what we're hearing today. So I hope I can provide a little bit of insight for you on that. So a few little obligatory housekeeping bits before we get stuck in. Now, how it's going to work, I'm going to pass to each of our speakers for a short introductory remarks. And then I will turn to some questions afterwards and delve a little bit deeper. I do invite you all to follow along on social media, and you can do so via the hashtags either Terramadre 2022 or Regeneration. So, Piero, let me turn to you first. You have long studied the history of agriculture, and you work to connect the dots between agriculture, neoliberalism, capitalism. Talk to us a little bit about the work that you do.
Good evening to start with. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having this large number. Rather than my work, I will talk about it, but implicitly, I would first of all like to congratulate the organization that is for the idea, that is to say, to have an idea on regeneration, because all of this, all of Terra Madre this year, this edition, is under this umbrella. And you see, regeneration is the key of success of Homo sapiens sapiens. So that is to say, humanity, we have survived and we have become 8 billion individuals on the planet Earth thanks to regeneration. A procedure, a style, and a way of producing nourishment which disappeared only about a century ago, because for thousands of years our economy was the economy of regeneration, of the refertilization of the land, but also a circular regeneration of materials. Since I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to give you an example which, from a literary point of view, will say a lot. I'm going to read the 17th chapter of the Odyssey, which concerns Ulysses, who finds his dog Argus outside the doors or the gates of Ithaca. Here, let us read what Homer says. Now there, he was lying down, and I'm sorry, I will be retranslating it as I can, because he was sitting on manure of oxen, and he wanted the servants, because he was dying, to take him to fertilize the land of Ulysses. So what happened at that time, it was that manure and offings was then taken to the fields to fertilize them. So there was a continuous exchange between the refuse that the city and the animals were producing, and the countryside was an ongoing activity. So whatever the city produced, it was then taken back to the land. There is a book that was published in 2001 by Ercole Sori, an Italian historian, which was called The City and Refuse, from the Middle Ages to the early 20th century. He talks about, or writes about, how in the medieval communes, they extracted from the cesspits all the material, and then it was the refuse, human refuse, and sold to the farmers. In my book, La Mucca e Savia, the cow and the savia, which I also wrote, I mentioned the fact, I quoted Goethe, who was surprised in seeing the fact that they gathered organic refuse in Naples, which was then taken to the green gardens around the city, became it's sort of a compost to use on the land around the city where they were growing vegetables. This was happening when the Industrial Revolution broke out, because in fact this happened even with the oil residues and all the things that were left over, say, from the hops and beer. All of this ended up in agriculture because they were able to reproduce the help the organic material. This happened until chemicals were brought in. Chemicals are from minerals. In fact, think of potassium, phosphorus, while nitrogen is different, because nitrogen at one time came from the Chile mines, and now we use oil for it. But it's not just agriculture, but also ferrous materials, iron. From any tools that were broken was recycled. This also happened during the Industrial Revolution. But allow me to give me some more information on this. In the U.S., which is currently the land of hyper-consumerism, still in the 1920s, people didn't throw anything away. That is to say, white goods, fridges and the like, were repaired. The attitude towards goods was that of reusing them and conserving them. So when did all this change? When did this economy of regeneration of materials, of natural materials, which, and the speaker does not finish the sentence, but this means regeneration of nature, because all of this comes from nature. When did all this happen? It happened after the 1930 crisis, because the top managers and industrialists realized that there was a contradiction between the productive ability or capacity that the companies had and excess production and the sobriety of the American citizens who only used what they needed. As a result, it was necessary to eliminate this contradiction, and they did it in two ways. First of all, with the planned obsolescence. That is to say, products had to be made so that they would die, in quotes, at a certain point, that they shouldn't last, and this is what happened. And the other thing is advertising. Create artificially generated needs in the souls of citizens, making the citizens or people needy. Currently, people are needy and they need something which is artificially generated by the advertising, which from the sky, from the land, from the sea, from any devices, even in the toilets, public toilets, everywhere there is an invitation to consume. We are obsessed by an all-powerful, all omnivorous advertising power.
And all this happens for a very clear reason, and I'll now stop because I don't want to go beyond the time allotted to me. This doesn't happen because of the maliciousness of people who govern us, but because the capitalistic production system, manufacturing system, is based on exactly that. If it doesn't increase its production constantly, its production and its revenues, it dies. But we can no longer afford this. It's no longer possible. This system has imploded today. That's why we have this environmental chaos, because this excess of production and consumption worked, and it became compatible with the planetary balances as long as it only concerned a part of the globe, the United States, Europe, Japan. But now it affects all the peoples of the earth. The planet can't stand this. It no longer can bear this unlimited expansion of production and consumption, because it devours more resources than the planet can actually regenerate it. And so we have to change our economic model first and foremost. I hope I'll be able to speak again later to say something about prospects, because there are prospects. Let me just say something in those terms. The most interesting prospects of a new world of consuming, of producing, of living and socializing already exists, as our President said on opening the meeting, and that is agriculture based on biodiversity, small crops, mixed crops that respect the soil, regenerate its fertility, regenerate the source of life. Because think about this, life on Earth has its origins in the soil, this decomposition of the mother rock, of this fragment of star that little by little, under the action of atmospheric agents, has decomposed and has led to the presence of carbon and many other minerals. And that's what life stemmed from. And so we've got to ensure that this source of life be regenerated and become the focus of our attention. And so together we can save the earth and also save society from the armed conflicts that have now put us all at peril. I'm sure somebody will be asking me about the war in the Ukraine, but I'll answer that question later if it does come. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Covered a lot of grounds in your 10 minutes, really squeezed everything into that. So thank you very much for that. So Myrna, I'd like to pass to you now to talk a little bit about the central role of indigenous people and women specifically in regenerative agricultural systems. So over to you.
Thank you, Natasha. No sé si me ven.
Okay.
Naxa al sutralam kulatara maikisna. I greet you in the Miskito language of my people from Nicaragua. I'm from a very small village on the border of the Rio Huanqui, the Rio Coco, between Honduras and Nicaragua. And of course, producing food was the main activity during my childhood. And from them, I learned that indigenous people's food system is very linked to traditional values, to Mother Earth, to Pachamama, as it says as they say in South America. What is Pachamama? The one who feeds us. And it's very important because it's a feminine word, women, because it's related with care, it's related with love, it's related with feeding, with nutrition. Through that relation between Mother Earth and the people that eat from Mother Earth, we are able to build collective values. We are able to build consensus. We are able to solve problems and conflicts. We are able to build respectful relation between men and women. We are able to transmit through generations those values. And all of that is related with reciprocity, permanent reciprocity. And that is what I understand as loving Earth. So for us, indigenous people's food system, we relate it with solidarity, with inclusiveness, with healthiness, with sustainability, and of course, with equity. But equity, and when we talk about these values, we're not thinking only on indigenous peoples. We're thinking on all humankind. We do not produce food thinking that that will solve only our problem. When we come to these type of events, we are telling you that if we do it in the good way, we can feed everybody, and everybody can be healthy, but especially Mother Earth can be healthy. We are facing a lot of threats, not only as indigenous peoples, but we have land grabs, we have racism, and racism means control over our territories and control over our bodies. We face agricultural systems that are killing our traditional agriculture. And in name of prosperity, we have seen how our ecosystems have been destroyed, how human beings have been destroyed, how food is disappearing, water, air. But we haven't stayed with our just crying. We have done a lot of things to try to change that situation. 470 million indigenous peoples, 4,000 languages, 5,000 different indigenous peoples. We are protecting biodiversity. 80% of biodiversity that remains in the earth are in the areas that we control. And how are we doing this? We say we are rebuilding the cordon umbilical between human beings and nature, and trying to build a different type of world of solidarity. In Pawanka Fund, we support 110 initiatives, local initiatives related with revitalizing traditional food system out of 300. So almost 1/3. And what have we learned? What are communities doing? The first thing is that they are recuperating this vision, this holistic vision of indigenous production combined with indigenous food. Good food is related with good management of territories. So, and how do they do that? They apply their traditional knowledge system, what we would call ecological knowledge, where we really try to diversify production, where we try to use traditional food, where we cultivate not only plants, we also cultivate land, territories, for the areas that have been degraded. We rotate land, water, fishing times, the Vedas that we call. We have been able, through movement like slow food, to influence chefs that are beginning to use our food. They're beginning to change their vision. And we believe that through this type of work, we can change the narrative of governments, the narrative of the people that are in power. And they will, through that, begin to apply and promote different policies that can really respect that way of producing food. We have learned that indigenous peoples are resilient to climate change. I come from an area that was affected a year and a half ago by 2 hurricanes, Category 5, in 15 days, in less than 15 days. Last week, I visited the community that was completely destroyed, Halover. And the communities, no one is dying for hunger. They're all eating. Maybe they're not eating enough because they still are learning how to save and protect the seeds that they were able to save after the hurricane. But they are happy and again rebuilding their community. Those are the type of experiences that we see in indigenous communities that are affected by climate change. What else are we doing? We are promoting the respect of our customary laws that are based on spirituality, on rituals, areas where sacred sites combined with areas where you produce, areas where you conserve. Those regulations that are in our customary law, some of them were only oral, but now they are becoming written regulations that are respected by the communities. All of this is based on reciprocity. Everybody in a community has something to do with food production. The girls, the boys, the women, the men, everybody plays a role. Because we do not feel that you can solve the big problems in the world only working alone. Everybody is needed. That's why it's important for indigenous peoples to bring our voices to the international level. Because we can continue doing a lot with our resources, but you can also do a lot to change your patterns of consumptions, to change the way in which you are treating the Pachamama, Mother Earth. We have a very strong movement of youth going back to the communities after COVID. And they're going back, and they have learned from their elders that they have to go and continue producing food, because that is the only way in which they will save their culture and contribute to save the planet. That's the way in which we love Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I really loved your definition of loving Earth as reciprocity. I think that's a really beautiful way to put that, and I think that was a very positive spirit that you brought here today talking about that. So thank you very much. Virginie, I will pass to you now. Myrna was talking about the hurricane. Where Myrna mentioned hurricanes and the impact after that, and we've had this summer, we've seen some of the worst droughts that we've had over Europe, and something that's just likely to worsen with climate change. It was quite clear that we were quite woefully underprepared for that, even though it's quite clear, all the problems that we're facing. I know your work revolves around the impact of our diets on climate change. Perhaps you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Bonsoir tout le monde.
Good evening to you all. I'm going to take advantage of the fact there's a translation service so that I can speak in my own language. I'm Virginie Raisson. I'm not a journalist, actually. I'm a researcher, and I'm specialized in future prospects and transition. So I'm interested in transition and complexity. And it's some years now that I've also been working a lot on climate issues, because I'm part of an interdisciplinary group of experts on climate, the GC, and we work on climate issues and also on agricultural issues, because the two topics are obviously closely linked. And it's a bit that I'd like to talk about today. I don't know whether any of you have read the recommendations of the VIEC report that was published last year, but I'll come to one of the recommendations and tell you what it's based on. For the first time, the GEC has made a recommendation stating that one of the means we have today to change the way things are going is to reduce our meat consumption, because our diet, and especially our meat consumption, has a very high effect on climate, on global warming, but not only. And that's what I'd like to show you, starting again from a systemic analysis. So the starting point of all this is an excellent piece of news, and that is, with everything one can say, and you spoke about this earlier, economic globalization, capitalism are very destructive, but there has been a significant increase in the level of life as of the 1980s. This has meant also improved access to leisure time, to health. It has also led to an increase in the number of calories consumed, especially calories, proteins, and calories from animals. So this especially means meat products. And when you have about 1 billion people who emerge from poverty and another million people who enter the middle class, necessarily this leads to a significant increase in meat consumption. The problem is that to consume this meat, you need lots and lots of cereal, of grain, because part of the meat, I'm thinking, for instance, of ruminants, cows, ox, they can be held in pasture land, but most of the animals are raised industrially. That is, they're in cattle lots in very small spaces where they're nourished. They're not even nourished, but they're stuffed with grains, soya, and other cereals. And so the problem is that for about 1 kilo of meat, you need between 7 and 11 kilos of grains. So basically, instead of using the cereals for human consumption, the grains are given to an animal, and the animal's going to decrease the amount of original protein that it's been fed on. And at the same time, you need more and more water. In times of global warming, clearly water is increasingly rare resource in an increasing number of countries. And you know that 70% of drinking water in the world is used by agriculture. So the more one uses agriculture, the more water one needs. And then when one uses water for agricultural purposes, generally there are also chemical products that are used. They filter down into the waterbeds, and so these chemicals contaminate the earth and the soil.
De plus en plus.
This means that you need more and more land. And when you need more and more land, what does that mean? Well, it means that there's going to be, because there's not a lot of land that is available, it means a lot of pressure. And it means that currently there are countries who buy other pieces of land in other countries, for example, China purchasing part of Africa. And this is clearly a problem which is very big for the countries where the land is sold. It also means clearly that there's deforestation, since there's not many farmable land in particular, but in Indonesia, Malaysia, in particular in Central Africa, and in the Amazon, there's a lot of deforestation. There are a lot of consequences of this. First of all, it impacts on the local countries and the way in which they live, they survive, and they feed. It also has problems on biodiversity and all the ecosystems that the forest gives us, medications, ecosystems, and so on. And furthermore, there is also CO2 related issues, because when you burn the trees, there's more CO, but you also eliminate carbon sinks because the forests do this. And when you destroy the Amazon, you are reducing the carbon sink. And then also you convert the land. And as you know, the 20 centimeters of the topsoil, 20 centimeters above, there's methane, for example, in the peat areas. The fact that we need more and more agricultural land has this consequence, and this means that there are a lot of animals that are, in fact, that were in the primary forest and at this point are released, and they enter in contact with domestic animals, the cattle and the breeders and others that are, for example, close to human beings and that contaminate human beings. It's the story of COVID or of all the zoonoses, that is to say, all the diseases that come from wild species and come through this transmission chain and deforestation. That is, then you also need, since we haven't got enough land, we increase this productivity, which means more nitrates, because in more chemicals, which means, for example, you're going to have green algae in the rivers, or you destroy some of the natural species and birds. It also means there's more oxide protoxide. This means that methane is much more powerful than CO2 because it's about 100-fold more powerful. And also, it means more energy, more fossil fuel energy, because most of these, it means that most of the fertilizers are produced by oil derivatives, but you also need the mechanization. You can take into consideration mechanization of agriculture means more CO2, and it also means that the soil is compacted, and that to increase production. But then you also have to see the consequences of industrial breeding or animal husbandry using also antibiotics. One of the big problems of health, public health, is antibiotic resistance, which is linked to the use of meat that has been treated with antibiotics, and also the animals issue methane, which is much more powerful than CO2, as I mentioned, and luckily it only stays 10 years in the atmosphere, while CO2 lasts a century. And as I mentioned earlier on, more animal breeding and more animal husbandry, more contact. And then there's international trade to transport these animals, these cereal, more international trade, which means more transport, more CO2, and a more consumption of meat, which means cardiopathology, which means heart diseases. And to conclude, because very often you were asked, is the problem, would not it be the increase of the world population? And I'm going to give you 3 figures to measure to what extent this meat consumption is the key to many problems, in particular when you're North American or European. Today, if everyone ate like the Japanese, they're not vegetarians, but when they eat fish or meat, they eat a very small quantity. If we were all to eat like the Japanese, and I'm not going to talk about fish now, we could already nourish, without increase world production, 8 billion people on this. If everybody were to eat like the Bhutanese are not vegetarians, but they eat about 100 grams of meat per week, and they eat a lot of dairy products. We could nourish 12 billion with the current production, which means you no longer need to deforest or anything. And we could go to a much more reasonable agriculture. If everybody were to nourish themselves as an Italian or French, we can really only nourish 4 billion people, which means that the mere change of food habits in Europe could have a great impact, especially because of the methane production. And as we can rapidly reduce methane, 25% of the greenhouse gases come from animal husbandry and breeding, so we could improve our health, improve the climate change, and maintain the situation as it is with changing our eating habits, and I find that extraordinary.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Short of time, but last but not least, I will run past to Larissa. I know you've prepared a little presentation for us about your work on pesticides. And as I mentioned in the introduction, you had to leave Brazil as a consequence of your work. So I'm hoping perhaps you could also tell us a little bit about that story in your remarks. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Natasha. Yes, indeed, I had to leave my country because of my research. I've been a professor at the Department of Geography at the University of São Paulo. And in the latest years, I've been dedicated to study the issue of the use of pesticides. And in 2017, after I have made a postdoc in Scotland, I've launched an atlas called Geography, the use of agrotoxins in Brazil and its connection to the European Union. And while I was in Brazil talking to the Brazilian public, just in Portuguese, my atlas was in Portuguese, nothing happened. Even when I was at our Chamber of Deputies in our public audience telling, please look at what's going on. children are dying, pregnant women have been poisoned by pesticides, the level of malformation is increasing, the cancer in childhood is increasing, etc. Nothing happened. But once I've launched the English version of this atlas here in Europe, then it changed it completely. When I clearly remember one night in Glasgow when a French journalist called me and he asked me how was the situation with my personal situation dealing with this subject, and I said, no, it's okay because all my research is based on public data, official data, so I'm protected. But that was the first night that I had insomnia. Yes, it was the first night, and then after that, lots of nightmares because of this. And when I back to Brazil, I received countless emails with double ambiguous message. You know, after I had given an interview on TV on how is it called when we have at night a journalist interviewing? So on TV, and then I talked about aerial spraying in Brazil, and then I received an email in which the person identified himself as a pilot of agricultural aircraft, this kind of aircraft that sprays pesticides, and he told me, look, if the professor thinks that aerial spraying is not a safe technique, I invite her to come with me in my airplane to see how safe it is, something like that. And then I was advised to avoid my routine, to change my ways, to go to the university, take the children, etc. And so it was totally impossible because I am a mother of 2 children, so we have this exactly the same schedule every day. And then my colleague, who was my professor when I was a student in my university, he said, look, you cannot deal with this big issue by just alone. Let's talk to our director. And she called our dean. And the dean of University of São Paulo, it's not a small university, it's the biggest university in Brazil. And he told me, so look, I think that it's a good idea if the professor goes abroad to develop another postdoctorate. And I offer her the guard body in the campus. It's not guard body, it's a kind of police in the campus, but he offered me the police in the campus while I was working there, but I refused because I thought I'm going to be paranoid. I needed to be emotionally well structured to take care of my kids. And then I've started to looking for ways to leave the country. And then, and this is one example, but I received also some threats regarding my research. You know, what the professor is saying in Europe she's lying, it's not true, Brazilian agriculture is sustainable, etc. And one of these person who wrote an article in a newspaper, he is really known in Brazil, and he tried to discredited my research, and then my university asked the right of answer, and we get, and then I wrote an article putting all of the data again, replying each point. So, and then it was really, really difficult. And then finally, in the end of 2019, I was in Brussels, where I am currently live in. I was invited to give a conference, a talk at the European Parliament. It was an open conference regarding EU-Mercosur agreement. And then I went there and I showed everything. And what I am telling, what I'm calling everything is like some numbers. For example, each 2.5 days, one person dies in Brazil because of the intoxication. In the latest 10 years, more than 500 babies between 0 and 12 months old were poisoned by pesticides. Just data like that. And then the person who invited me asked me, how is the situation in Brazil, your personal situation dealing with this subject? And I told him, so it's hard. And I said to him what was going on. And then, but then I told him, but no one, at least no one told me I'm gonna kill you. And then he looked at me and he said, oh, come on, Larissa, it doesn't come with an invitation. It could happen in different ways. I know Latin America, and his wife is a Colombian woman. And then I thought, oh, God, I've been so naive. And then I said to him, look, but in Brazil, our country is really racist, and the class division is really high. I am a professor, white professor in the university. And then he looked at me again, Larissa, Zuzu Angel was also like you. Zuzu Angel, for who doesn't know, was a mother of an activist during our dictatorship, and her son was murdered by the government, and after she denounced what happened to her child, it happened to her also. And then I was completely frozen, and he said to me, don't back to Brazil. You stay here, someone will bring your children. And I was so in doubt what I do, I didn't know what was the best thing to do. And then I decided to back to Brazil. And then I was organizing everything. And one day before I buy my ticket, the COVID, the pandemic came and I couldn't travel. And I spent the whole 2020 in Brazil, and my house was assaulted, and probably it was related to my research. I cannot prove, but there are some indications that it was related. So finally, I was in touch with a colleague in Belgium at VUB, Free University of Brussels, and we applied for, and there was a call for researchers, and we applied, and my project was approved. And finally, I left the country last year with my 2 kids. I'm living in Brussels. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this. And it's interesting to hear that you had the opportunity to speak at the European Parliament about this connection with the EU and with Brazil. There is currently ongoing a lot of discussion. Maybe I can ask you a question about this, actually, because we don't have loads of time, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say to this. So there's a lot of discussion right now about stopping the export of pesticides that are banned in the EU. So they're pesticides that are not permitted in the EU, but they are exported to third countries. Now, Germany just last week said they would stop this practice and would push for it at the EU level. But I've spoken to the Commissioner, and I've spoken to many others that are obviously industry players are not in favor of this. Now, I want to put the argument they give me for why they're stopping it to you, and I'd like to hear your response to what they're saying. Now, the argument is from them that it's kind of a twofold argument. There's two reasons. The first one is that they say the EU maybe shouldn't have the right to set the rules for other countries, right? So this is idea of condescending or paternalistic. Should we have the right to set the rules for the rest of the world? And the other reason is that different countries have different needs with different pest pressures, right? So then it should be on them to decide. I'd be very curious to hear what you would say to that if you had the opportunity.
I could call this, it's a huge hypocrisy, because, so maybe I can show some slides. I'm not sure if it's red, but yes. So just to build my answer, here we have the pesticides exports in the world. So as you can see, there is a huge asymmetry between North and South. And the European Union, look how even the small countries are super dilated, they are really bigger according what they represent in terms of pesticides exportation. So it's not a fair argument, you know. They are arguing their own favor, you know. And here we have the sales of the top 12 global pesticides companies, and the companies headquartered in the European Union are controlling no less than 30% of this market. And a huge amount of these are products that are not allowed in their own territory. I'm gonna quickly show this, and the same companies that are controlling the pesticides are the ones that are controlling the seed sales. So they are controlling the agriculture in these two, in the beginning and in the end of the production. And here we have a map showing the exportation of pesticides from European Union to Mercosur countries. It was more than 50 million kilos in 2018. And here we have the amount exported of banned pesticides. It's about 14%. So that's why I'm calling this a hypocrisy. What I'm calling this a huge, may I say, huge hypocrisy? Because they are super interested in this market, and they are protected by we look at the international framework about pesticides, we have Basel Convention, Stockholm Convention, and Rotterdam Convention. They are not enough. The European Union is hiding behind the law that protects European Union, because according to these conventions, the country which is importing some pesticides that are not allowed in the country which is exporting, they have to consent. I am aware, for example, Brazil must consent. I am aware that some countries exporting fipronil for us, but I know what this product causes, etc., and I agree. So European Union is hiding behind this legislation, which is not fair. It's a not fair legislation. It's not just not fair, but it's not enough. We need a new, from my point of view, we need a new landmark for pesticides. It's not enough. What's going on in the whole world, in the global south, it's not related to our climate, because it's tropical and then you need another kind. Come on. If we decided to grow an area equal Germany with the soybean in our country, it's a political decision, political and economic decision. We are not talking about climate. If we are talking about climate, let's do agroecology in the whole world on indigenous practices. That is respect our environment. So I think it's an ugly hypocrisy.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for sharing your views on that. It's a discussion that will be happening more and more in the EU, so something to watch for. I'm very conscious of the time. I have so many questions for our other panelists. I'm going to try and squeeze in maybe one question, like last question for each one. And on the topic of EU legislation, I wanted to bring in Virginie, because there is also currently this discussion. It was voted on in the Parliament last week, if not the week before, about banning imports of products such as beef and maize that are associated with deforestation. Now, this is moving through EU legislation right now as we speak. It will be discussed by member states, and there will be, discussions on this upcoming. Could this idea address some of the things that you were speaking about in your introductory remarks, the issues of deforestation? How far do you think this could have a positive impact? What are your views on this? Oui, sûr.
En fait,
Well, actually, yes. But it depends on how it's done. What I mean is that the agricultural system as we see it today, the agri-food system at a global level, has now been globalized for the past 30 years, and it's helped a number of countries, the Americans, the Europeans. It's helped them sell their products and have less costly consumption, and so it destroyed the food economy of many countries that now depend on exports and imports from the other countries. So we are stopping imports now because they're not correct politically, but we forget why the situation is what it is today. As I was saying earlier, the consumption of beef or palm oil, it's not the Indonesians who ate Nutella or the potato initially. And so now we should accompany all this. There must be a regeneration of the soil, of the land of these countries, and regenerate subsistence agriculture. And to just say, well, let's stop importing is a little too easy. And I think it's very irresponsible vis-à-vis the economies and populations of those countries. So we can't just ban imports. We have to accompany how agriculture will be changing in those countries.
Maybe I have a couple more minutes. I'm looking to see if I can stretch it a little bit. I don't see anyone saying anything, so I'm going to just one more question each. Perhaps, Piero, you did mention in your introductory remarks you would like to talk a little bit about the impact of the Ukraine war. Now, in the EU, the policy discussion has turned so much to food security, and it's been used as a justification to drop or relax a lot of green measures that we've seen in the EU. I suppose my question is so maybe there's two parts to the question. The first one being, how can we challenge this idea of food security? It's a very emotive issue. It's used in a lot of justifications, and stop the green agenda from being, from falling to the wayside. And also, do you see opportunity in this crisis that we're having right now? We're having an energy crisis. Is there something positive to be said for maybe the impacts of what this crisis could have for the future of regenerative farming?
Io credo che
Well, I believe that the war in the Ukraine, to a certain extent, is something that allows us to foresee what will happen in our future. It anticipates that international controversies can't be solved through compromises and peace agreements, but seem to be solved through wars. And so with the ultimate war of the annihilation of mankind, because the economy of all countries is based on 19th century, 18th century approach. Every country pursues in a competitive way its own territories, the development of its own state. And this is no longer possible because at a certain point, if every state only pursues its own exclusive needs and competes with everyone else, this was possible when the world offered possibilities to all. But already today, fertile land is increasingly more limited. Water also is decreasing in its availability. The drought we see in many areas of the planet will make it increasingly at risk. You know that the glaciers are melting. Do you know what the melting of the glaciers means in the Po Valley here? It means the disappearance of the hydrographic system that made the whole Po Valley so rich. The Po will disappear, its affluence. So not only agriculture, but industry will no longer be possible. The intensive breeding will no longer be possible in the Po Valley. And the problem is that we need a new international order, an international order based on cooperation. One Italian jurist who's well known in Latin America, Luigi Ferraioli, published a book titled "We Need a New Constitution for the Earth to govern agreements in a cooperative way," because as we were saying, we have food for 12 billion people. That's what we need. And today, there's waste of 1,300,000,000 tons of food that would be enough to feed 4 billion people. So we need a new political approach and setup that bans wars. I don't want to say anything about the war in the Ukraine, but let's at least mention the fact that nobody talks about the effects that this war is having on the climate, the production of CO2 and other gases that alter the atmosphere, the destruction of green areas, territories. It's a catastrophe for the climate, and this government keeps sending weapons. So one says, Russia certainly must be condemned because it's invaded a country. There's no doubt about that. But we can't tell Russia, we'll sit down at a table if we keep sending tanks and missiles and weapons. We, as Italians and as Europeans, we should say, okay, we're going to stop sending weapons, but you, Putin, have to sit down at a table, and you, with the help of the UN, with other partners of goodwill, you must find an agreement, and the Ukrainians must find an agreement too. There's no problem that can't be solved in a peaceful way. No problem in the world. One has to be reasonable, and somebody has to give something, and an agreement has to be found, and everybody will gain from this. From a peace agreement between Russia and the Ukraine, a new philosophy might emerge, a new way of tackling world problems, a ban on wars, a ban on weapons. And sorry, Natasha, there's a global situation that must be denounced, and that's the position of the United States. The United States are the only country in the world with 800 military bases outside its borders. Why? Who's the enemy? What need is there for it? The Soviet Union no longer exists. The historic enemy has disappeared. The Warsaw Pact has fallen apart. Why 800 bases? And the United States has spent $800 billion a year in armament, enormous figure. And when we criticize NATO, they say you're enemies of the Americans. No, we're friends of the Americans, because those $800 billion could be sent for schooling, for health, that's very expensive in the States, for health care and care for the elderly. In the United States, there are millions of poor people, not just amongst the black population.
A new world order, an agriculture, the small holdings that has a relationship of love with the land should inspire a new relationship among human beings. No longer a competitive agriculture, but a regenerating agriculture, an agriculture based on the cooperation between humans and nature and amongst human beings.
Thank you very much. We really are out of time now, unfortunately. We have one more minute, and I was hoping to come back to you, Myrna, to maybe end on a note of positivity. I know you spoke about the youths with COVID afterwards returning to the land. Maybe a one-minute quick summary of something positive that we can go away from this conference with a spirit of positivity, perhaps.
Share slow food philosophy in the world, coherence, love to nature, love to one another. Let's respect one another. Recognize that all of us are subjects of human rights, and follow our lessons as indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Less than a minute, yeah?
Thank you, very good.
Less than a minute.
Yes, perfect, yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our organizers. I hope you all have a great evening and a wonderful weekend at Terra Madre. Thank you very much.